And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable Channel 4. I'm Eliot Parker, your host for this program. And Chapters profiles a lot of the local authors, writers, and publishers in our region and in our community. And we're pleased to be joined by our first science fiction writer of our first series here and first season of Chapters, S.G. Redling. And she is a 15-year veteran of morning radio and an avid traveler. And she parlayed her degree in English from Georgetown University into various careers, including a waitress, a monument tour guide, a sheepskin packer, and finally a radio host. So she has done a little bit of everything. She currently lives in Huntington, West Virginia. She is the author of the science fiction thriller Flowertown and the recently published science fiction thriller Damocles. And we'd like to welcome S.G. Redling, Sheila Redling, to our program.
Hello.
Sheila,
you can call me
Sheila.
Thank
you so much. Absolutely. That's going to be one of the questions I'm going to get to with you a little bit later on. But thanks so much for joining us. We're delighted to have you.
I'm excited this program's underway. I think this is a great idea. Good for you, Elliot.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been a great success so far, and we look forward to this episode and many more episodes in the future. So, you being our first science fiction writer, tell us a little bit about why science fiction and how you got interested in writing science fiction.
Well, it's kind of a strange leap. My publisher's asking me that very same question. The first book, Flowertown, was a straight thriller with a science fiction undertone, so it had a nice crossover. Because it's actually published by Thomas and Mercer, who is thrillers, but then they marketed it in the sci-fi market because of the whole dystopian, apocalyptic sort of idea. And then Damocles, the one that just came out in May, is straight, old school, kind of groovy sci-fi. It's sort of an abrupt turn from Flowertown. I can't say why I picked it. I didn't set out to be a sci-fi writer or a thriller writer. But, I didn't even tell you, when a story grabs you, you go where it wants to go. So they're pretty different. Flowertown's a very, very gritty, violent thriller, as you probably know. And Damocles is much more sort of old school Star Trek kind of sci-fi.
My next question before we get into those works a little bit is something we touched on in the open. Sheila Redling is your name, but you write under S.G. Redling. And we see...
Yeah.
Writers do this a lot. They sometimes have pen names. They sometimes have aliases they go by, or they abbreviate their initials. Mm-hmm. Is that something you set out to do? Is that something your publisher sort of leaned to? How does a writer go about choosing that or making that decision, or choosing if that's right for them?
It was sort of a tough decision because, as I said, I write thrillers mainly, and the thriller market is predominantly male authors. And believe it or not, even in 2013, they still say that a male author generally won't pick up a male reader won't pick up a woman's book. I think it's kind of ridiculous. I don't think it's actually true anymore. But to be honest, I'm not super proud of this. The reason I write under SG is no one ever spells Sheila correctly, ever, ever. And so I thought, when my first book comes out, if it's spelled wrong, I'll die. Mm-hmm. So it's just easier to write under SG. Plus, after 15 years on the air, I was just Sheila on the radio. So it was kind of nice to separate the two.
Absolutely. I totally understand that. Let's talk about your first novel, Flowertown, which you mentioned is a thriller with some science fiction undertones. It's a great story, and I'll let you talk a little bit more about it in just a second. But, one of the things that caught my attention, and I'm not an avid reader of science fiction, but I love your science fiction.
Oh, well, thank you.
And, but one of the things that was interesting about Flowertown is the undertone and the history that you have with the fictional chemical company, Chemical, in the story is so I think germane to what we in this region have identified with, because we are a chemical region, and folks that are familiar with DuPont, and we're familiar with Dow Chemical, and we're familiar with the chemical plants up Route 52 going into Wheelersburg and Ironton, and we're familiar with that whole manufacturing chemical industry, and so you take that sort of as the backdrop for the story and what this chemical company is doing to the people of Flowertown. So tell us a little bit about how that worked into the story, and really, what is the premise for Flowertown?
The idea of Flowertown is that 7 years ago, a chemical company, Chemical, spilled an experimental pesticide in rural Iowa. They had a shelter in place, which everyone in this area is familiar with a shelter in place. We all grew up with those. A truck would crash on the highway, and everyone would have to shelter in place. They start out as a short-term shelter in place. When they can't decontaminate it, it becomes a long-term quarantine. 7 years later, it's still a medically maintained quarantine. The Army's there. When the story begins, resources are being cut off, the power grid's starting to fail, the Army's withdrawing, and nobody knows why. They can't leave, they're still contaminated. I don't think anyone in this area is surprised that that was the topic for Flowertown. I mean, how many 7-year-olds, how many times did you grow up and have the carbon tetrachloride spills in the water? You know, as a little kid, they had a little cartoon for it. On Saturday morning cartoons, boil the water, you know, because there was another spill. It used to really scare me as a kid. And when I started out with Flowertown, I knew the premise. I wanted people isolated. But I didn't want it to be, you know, Escape from New York. I didn't want it to be, if it was a big city like Los Angeles, the media would never leave it. It had to be someplace where the media would go on with another story. You know, this area is like that. Anything happens here, it's in the news for one day, national media goes on. Iowa's another place, Arkansas, these little communities that would just have to live with this situation when the rest of the world would go on to the next tragedy, the next horrible incident. And it did work out that it was Iowa. I was going to try originally to put it in West Virginia, but I thought, I'd like to see you try to quarantine 7 miles of West Virginia or Ohio or Kentucky. People wouldn't do it. It would be geographically impossible, and I think culturally impossible.
I think so too, and
We're too
and
mean,
especially
Elliot.
absolutely,
Yeah.
and our terrain sort of lends itself
Yeah.
to problems with that. One of the things that's interesting too about Flowertown is you've got a fantastic female protagonist who has a tie-in romantically with someone who works for and with the Army. So tell us a little bit about who we follow through this journey of living and residing in Flowertown and her temptation and her desire to escape and to get to the outside.
Ellie is a great character. She was a tough character to write, but once you got into her head, she was an ad executive in Chicago, had a big career, had decided to take a break in her career and go to Spain for a summer with her boyfriend. So they pack up everything they own and they go to Iowa where he lives to drop their stuff off. They are not supposed to be there when the spill happens. He dies, his whole family dies. So basically everyone she knows in Iowa is dead and she can't leave. Her whole life comes to a screeching halt. And with some reasons that come out in the book, she goes to what she is best at, and that is being angry. She is furious, and she has nowhere to put it. She's trapped there, she's sick. She buries it under pot smoking, which is legal inside Flowertown, and her best friend is the biggest pot dealer there, and she has this sort of casual relationship with one of the Army guards that is a little more serious than she even wants to let on, because nothing is permanent in Flowertown except the fact that you're staying there. Because the people, the Army and the guards and the health workers, they're on 2-year medical visas. They have a special medication they can come in and go as they need to. But she's stuck there forever.
Absolutely.
She was a great character to write. She was so angry, but she was so smart and funny. And when I was trying to sell the book, I had so many editors say, oh, you know what? She's just unlikable. She's unlikable. I said, well, she's chemically contaminated and trapped in a quarantine zone. She's going to be a little grumpy, you know? She's a little salty. And then one editor actually said to me, no one's going to believe that women get that burned out. I thought, have you ever actually met a woman ever in your entire life? But yeah, it was a tough sell, but when it hit really well. People seem to really like it.
Yeah, and I know you've had a lot of success with Flowertown and with Damocles, which we'll get to a little bit later on in our discussion today. So after Flowertown, you set out to write Damocles, and Damocles was recently published. Talk to us a little bit about Damocles, what it's about, and why did you make the shift from the psychological science fiction thriller into more of a Gene Roddenberry, Isaac Asimov type of science fiction?
It was a strange transition. Damocles was an old story. You know how you have old stories that you have in your head and you think, someday I'm going to write them? Well, Flowertown came roaring out as the type of book it is. It's a very violent, fast-paced thriller. And then it sold. And there's a big gap between when you sign the contract until when your book comes out, like longer than you might imagine. So in that time, here I am on the brink of my whole world changing. And to say I'm stunned is an understatement. And I thought, if I don't write Damocles now, I may never have the nerve to write it again. This is the last time I'm going to be without expectation. You know, Flowertown may come out and sink like a stone and they never sign me again. Or it could do really well and they'll want more thrillers. So this is the last time in my life I'm going to be free to write exactly what I want. So I wrote it before Flowertown came out. And it kind of feels that way. I mean, the book has this sense of like happy, stunned exploration, which was where I was. I was on the brink of this whole new reality. And when I see the book now, I really see that in the world that I created with these people.
So talk to us a little bit about the storyline of Damocles. Who do we follow through the story? What can readers expect when they pick up Damocles?
I love this book. You know how some things some of your projects you love more than others? Like you just love
Absolutely.
beyond reason.
Absolutely.
This is such a strange book, and the whole time I was writing it, I thought, no one's going to want to read this book. It's a 300-page book about a conversation. The story is that on Earth, in the future, we have received a message from deep space that says, we are your ancestors, we interrupted your evolution, we also went to other worlds and did this, and if you ever have the technology, here's the chart to follow to see if you have other relatives in the universe. It causes all sorts of pandemonium on Earth, but it sends a 6-team astronaut mission into deep space one way to follow this map. And they come out of deep sleep when they have found a world that has the right qualifications, has a humanoid race on it. Their mission is to just study the world and see if contact can be made. But there's technical issues. They have to land before they're ready. And the story is told from the point of view of Meg, who is the Earth linguist, whose job it is to build a language, and Lul, the man on this planet, who is sort of a dreamer, everyman, kind of comic book nerd, optimist, who, through various reasons, is thrust to the front of this. And the whole book is these two people trying to learn how to build a language together.
Fantastic.
Oh, it was so much fun to write, because it's such a big encounter. But the funny thing is, the more I got into it, the smaller it got. It got down to, how do you say yes and no? How do you differentiate between not good and dangerous? Mm-hmm. Just the smallest things that you couldn't take for granted. Oh, I had so much fun writing that book.
Well, what I've read so far has been fantastic. So let me ask you about writing and about science fiction. The challenges of writing science fiction. Do you find it, I don't want to say has more rules maybe than another genre of writing, but we have sort of the story arc structure, the beginning, the climax, and the denouement, or the ending, that is pretty prevalent in all short stories and novels, good ones anyways.
Nice note.
Yes, absolutely. But do you find where you have to work in some of these other elements that maybe a diehard science fiction reader expects, like language differences and devices, and all of those things add another layer that make it somewhat more difficult to write that? Or is that just part of the plot and part of the storyline as you're setting it up?
I don't write consistently sci-fi. When I do put sci-fi elements, I'm planning a sci-fi thriller along the lines of Flowertown for next year. One thing I think about sci-fi, the audience is almost yours to lose. I think if you keep a consistent logic framework, do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like if you make a world and you set up the rules, as long as you're consistent, they'll go with it. Now, this has been a dividing line with Damocles, though, because Damocles is what we would call soft science. It is not how to build a spaceship and how to see another world. I take a lot of liberties because I ascribe to the old school science fiction like Asimov and Bradbury, where it was about the people. It was about the humanity of the science, not the science itself. Some people have hated it. Some people have said, that doesn't make any sense, it wouldn't work that way, that propulsion system's ridiculous. Oh, and one person actually complained that the research on first contact proves that my system would not work. And I was very tempted to answer and say, we haven't made contact, right? Yeah, I didn't miss a Nova episode, did I? Because as far as I know, it's still a theory. I tend to fall back, though, on the old sci-fi school of thought, that if you are consistent, just stay within the rules that you create for your world. With horror and sci-fi especially, those. And I think most horror, sci-fi, fantasy readers are a little more forgiving than, because I also write thrillers, and you have to stick to the rules in a thriller. You can't be monkeying around with your, a bad guy having a sympathetic bad guy or something. You have to have a villain.
Absolutely. Talk to us a little bit about your writing process. You've published 2 novels, and it sounds like you've got some ideas that you're mulling over for a third. Some of our writers have said, I have to make myself sit in the chair behind the computer or in front of the notepad for an hour and a half a day, and I have to do so many words before I get up. Other writers have said, well, I just write when sort of the muse inspires me. How's your writing process when it comes to putting something together?
Well, let's put it this way. I don't brush my hair very often, so it was kind of a challenge getting it today. You do get a little weird when you stay home and write. My third book comes out November 5th. I am doing rewrites for my fourth one, which I take everywhere with me right now. That comes out in the spring. I am a word count person. I am the sort of person that sets a daily word count, at least 1,000 words a day when I first start a story. By mid-book, I'm usually up to 2,000-3,000 words a day. I write quickly because I write sort of recklessly. I don't worry about editing. I believe in getting the whole first draft out, just throwing it out on the table, and then rewriting it, because I firmly believe good writing is rewriting, that it's like the do-over you don't get in real life. You know, your chance to take it back and get it right the next time.
Sure.
So that is, I really, really enjoy writing. I don't ever feel like, oh, I gotta do this. I mean, I now get to do it for a living, and I couldn't be happier with it. I don't always do it well. I mean, I'm not always sitting there just as productive as pie. I'm oftentimes just sitting in my chair like this and staring at the ceiling. And there's this, the dreaded writer's notebook that is everywhere with me.
Absolutely.
I do this for each book. This is number 11. And, you know, because a lot of writing, regardless of what people actually believe, a lot of time spent writing is just spent doing this. Mm-hmm. You have to have time to think. You have to have time to just get your head into that place. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that stops people more than anything. They won't let themselves have permission to just, you know, let go, let their mind go as far as it can go, and write it out to the end.
And I think that is something that we've heard a lot of writers on our show chapters have talked about, that about, you know, allowing yourself, giving yourself the permission to freely just put it out there, almost like you're doing sort of a brain dump, and just get it on a sheet of paper, and don't worry about, does it make sense, is it logical, does it all tie in, but getting it out there, seeing what sticks, and then going back and sort of going through the process. I
think you learn more from dragging one bad story across the finish line than you do from starting and abandoning 1,000 potential masterpieces.
Yeah.
You really learn what you're made of when you wrap up a story, even if it's a mess. Because you can't make it better until it exists. So finish it. Finish your stories.
Absolutely. Well, that's going to do it for us this time on this edition of Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.